Marie de Medici was the most dangerous queen in France's history. Power-hungry, she even tried to overthrow her own son. Yet at the end of her life, the fates had one final twist of cruelty in store. Marie de Medici, a name often evoked in connection with the formidable Medici dynasty, whose influential wealth and power stretched like veins through the lifeblood of Renaissance Europe. They were notable as bankers and mighty patrons, yes, but also puppeteers of political enterprise. Though Marie's early years were spent under the weighty banner of her grand lineage, it would not be long before she eclipsed even the longest shadows cast by her ancestors. In time, it was Marie herself who would emerge not merely as a Medici, but as a queen. Unyielding, divisive, and unforgettable. History often remembers her with the flat brevity of her title, Queen of France. But behind that crown lies a tale far more captivating, a tale steeped in betrayal, unrelenting ambition, and the calculated seduction of power. For Marie, authority was never a passive inheritance. It was a living flame, seized and stoked with patient cunning and merciless resolve. Born in 1575, the daughter of Francesco de' Medici I, Grand Duke of Tuscany, and Archduchess Joanna of Austria, Marie's early years were marked by a tumultuous and tragic series of events that would shape the woman she would become. From the very beginning, the Medici name came with a dark legacy of power and influence, a birthright she was bound to inherit. Her blood was an alchemy of Habsburg austerity and Medici intrigue, a combination destined to produce not meekness, but magnitude. And whatever turbulent star Her Majesty was born under seemed to be soaked in crimson and hemmed with shadow. At the tender age of 3, Marie bore witness to a life-altering trauma. In 1578, her mother, Joanna, tragically fell down a flight of stairs, resulting not only in her death, but that of the unborn child she carried. The official story was one of misstep and misfortune, but within the echoing halls of the Medici court, where accidents often took place with suspicious precision, the word tragedy rarely came unaccompanied. The child Marie, scarcely old enough to comprehend death, found herself quickly thrust into an unstable world. The mourning period had hardly settled when her father, Francesco, remarried. His new consort, Bianca Capello, had long been his mistress, a Venetian noblewoman whose hasty ascent to duchess set tongues wagging. Rumors thick and persistent as Tuscan fog whispered that Joanna's demise had been no accident at all, but an orchestration, her fall down the stairs rendered fatal by design. Nothing was ever proven. Nothing needed to be. For the young Marie, this upheaval was no mere domestic disturbance. It was the first lesson in a curriculum of dynastic brutality, a lesson in how swiftly affections could be traded for advantage, and how easily a mother could be replaced. But the Medici palace was not yet finished with the life lessons it could bestow upon Marie. In 1584, Marie had witnessed the burial of 2 of her siblings, and in 1587, in a turbulent twist of fate, both her father and stepmother died under suspicious circumstances. Poison was the presumed assassin, unspoken, unconfirmed, but omnipresent in graveside whispers. After a grim and turbulent 13 years of life, Marie stood not as a child, but as a survivor. Her childhood scorched away by grief had left in its wake a creature of silence and isolation. She had been orphaned not merely of parents, but of stability, trust, and the concept of safety. Where others might have broken, she began instead to take shape, a young woman tempered like steel in the crucible of the Medici palace. To cope, she clung to her one constant, a playmate by the name of Leonora Dori. Bereft of the close bonds of family, Leonora Dori became Marie's only confidant, a friendship Marie relied upon so heavily that she often struggled to make decisions without Leonora's input. The attachment was profound, and foreshadowed the devastating outcome that would arise from this dependency. And yet, for all that had been taken from her, not all was lost. Even if her family had dissolved into little more than ghosts and rumor, the Medici fortune had not. Marie, despite her orphan state, emerged as one of the wealthiest heiresses in Europe, prized not merely for her dowry, but for the prestige of her lineage. With her only surviving sister already married off, Marie was now the last Medici daughter of her generation, and the eyes of Europe turned towards her as suitors arrived like vultures cloaked in fine velvet. By the time she came of age, her beauty had become a topic of great discussion in noble society. With her striking eyes, cascading auburn hair, and an inborn grace of bearing, she possessed the kind of presence that made kings look twice, and their advisors look anxious. But Marie was not content to be merely ornament or asset. Where other noble women were bartered like coin, Marie was determined to carve a path of her own. Under the watchful eye of her uncle, now the Duke of Tuscany, she was granted a rare degree of marital agency. Marie was to be allowed to choose her own match, a remarkable luxury for a woman whose marital value could shape kingdoms. Marie did not waste the autonomy her uncle had given her. Instead, she chose boldly. She set her sights on the most powerful throne in Western Europe, that of Henry IV of France. But Henry was no idealized monarch. Known as much for his conquests of the bedchamber as the battlefield, the king was a man whose virtues were often outpaced by his appetites. His first marriage to Margaret of Valois had only recently ended in annulment, and his name was attached to an ever-expanding list of mistresses and illegitimate children. His court was rife with scandal, and his politics were a dance of expediency. Yet still, Marie saw in him not romance, but access. Not a lover, but a ladder. As it turned out, the King of France, a monarch in title if nothing else, was a man of meager means. Though the crown upon his brow glistened with ancient prestige, Henry IV's coffers were shamefully barren. The realm groaned under the weight of war debts, and the court lived in the faded splendor of former glory. His marriage to Marie was no act of passion. It was, rather, a transaction. He owed a staggering sum to the house of Medici, and Marie, radiant with both inheritance and influence, offered him a chance at financial resurrection. Thus, in a move that raised more than a few aristocratic eyebrows, their wedding was conducted by proxy in October of 1600. At the moment Marie became Queen of France, she had never once looked upon the face of her husband, and her first step onto French soil was not as a guest, nor even a bride, it was as its queen. When at last they met in person, Henry immediately lavished his new queen with pleasant words of flattery and gestures of warmth. The illusion held, briefly. So persuasive was his performance that by the time Marie arrived in Paris in January of 1601, she was already carrying the future of France. However, all of Henry's grand promises of wealth and luxury were shattered when she found her new home, the Louvre, in a state of disrepair. The charade of Henry's personality was nearly as quick to unravel, and Marie would soon come to learn that the love letters Henry penned to her in their brief courtship, sweet oaths of affection and ardent verses of commitment, had been copied nearly verbatim to his favorite mistress, Henriette d'Entraigues. Thus, Marie was unceremoniously initiated into the brutal realities of royal life. Her crown, for all the power it represented, offered no protection from the humiliations to come. Chief amongst her adversaries was Henriette. Jealous, bitter, and unafraid to spit venom at a queen, Henriette branded Marie the fat banker, a barbed insult aimed at both her origins and her appearance. With Henry's favor firmly in her pocket, Henriette operated with impunity. Marie could neither banish her nor silence her. But there was one thing Henriette could never claim. In September of 1601, Marie gave Henry what he had long desired, a legitimate heir, Louis, the Dauphin of France. The child was to be Marie's great triumph, securing not only her favor with the king, but her position as queen. The court exploded in celebration, for at last the Bourbon line was secured. Yet Marie's moment of glory was cut short by the return of Henry's wandering affections. Barely a month had passed before Henriette presented the king with a son of her own. Illegitimate, yet doted upon with an enthusiasm that rivaled and at times surpassed the joy Henry showed for his own heir. He declared the child more beautiful than the Dauphin, a cruel wound inflicted not just on Marie's pride, but on the legitimacy of her triumph. Henry's cruelty was often subtle, yet always deliberate. He delighted in pitting his queen and his mistress against one another. One moment he lavished Henriette with favors. The next, he forcibly shoved her head down for failing to curtsy properly before Marie. These theatrical humiliations served no purpose but his own amusement, and, perhaps, a warning to all who might think him a man bound by loyalty or decency. Surrounded by sycophants and scorned by her husband, Marie stood alone. The courtiers mocked her Italian accent, sneered at her reliance on her ever-present companion Leonora, and openly whispered that she would never truly be French. She was a queen, yes, but also a foreigner, an outsider, and a woman who dared to wield ambition where others expected only propriety and grace. Amidst it all, one interesting friendship arose. One of the deepest bonds she would develop in France would be with Margaret of Valois, Henry IV's first wife. The two women, once rivals, found solace in shared grief. The betrayal of the same man, the disillusionment of queenship, the loss of everything they had been promised. In the end, they shared more of sisterhood than animosity. Unfortunately, Margaret wouldn't live to see all that Marie would become, later passing away in 1615 after a short illness. Marie had taken 12 careful years choosing her husband and the course of her future. After such meticulous planning, she was not content to simply endure the duplicitous cruelty of the French court. She was a Medici, raised under a canopy of death, political machinations, and ambition. Life had taught her that power was not something you asked for. It was something you took. And so she steeled her will. Her ambition was no secret, nor was her temperament. Within the private chambers of the royal household, she ruled with a fire forged in loss and betrayal. Her frustrations with Henry were profound, but they were matched by her frustrations with her own children, particularly Louis. Marie believed that greatness was born not from tenderness, but from discipline. Her methods were not the gentle guidance of a doting mother, but the unflinching regimen of a monarch forging an heir. Her punishments were swift, severe, and often violent. For Marie, the stakes were too high to permit softness. She was not raising a child. She was sculpting a king. Louis, the long-awaited heir, proved to be a bitter disappointment to his mother. Though he bore the crown's future upon his fragile shoulders, he was far from the ideal prince Marie had envisioned. Plagued by ailments both physical and mental, the boy was often moody, withdrawn, and subject to explosive fits of temper. His stammer, an unforgiving affliction in a world where rhetoric was power, rendered communication labored and frustrating. He was not a prodigy, nor a natural-born leader. He was a troubled child, reared in a palace fraught with resentment, rivalry, and quiet despair. In his frailty, he mirrored the fractured world that had forged him. Yet for all his flaws, Louis remained Marie's clearest path to power. Her aspirations extended beyond the ornamental role of queen consort. She longed to rule. For nearly a decade, Henry denied her a coronation, and so she schemed and maneuvered through the labyrinthine politics of court, whispering into ears and seizing opportunities as they arose. At last, in May of 1610, her persistence bore fruit. Marie was crowned Queen of France in her own right. But the providence of kings is ever fickle. The very day after her coronation, King Henry IV was struck down in the streets of Paris by a fanatical Catholic zealot named François Ravaillac. The timing was too perfect, too convenient, and murmurs of conspiracy leapt from the shadows almost before the blood on Henry's cloak had dried. Was it divine will, a cruel stroke of coincidence, or something far more calculated? The court, long acquainted with Marie's ambition, did not hesitate to ask the forbidden question. Had the queen arranged it? Was this a coronation or a coup? The whispers spread like a plague through Versailles and Paris alike. Poisonous, persistent. Had Marie de Medici outdone her own forebears and puppeteered the fall of a king? Regardless of the truth, the result was undeniable. She was now the ruler of France. With her husband buried and her son too young to wield authority, Marie quickly and fiercely tightened her grip on power. The French Parliament, desperate for stability in the wake of assassination, confirmed her as regent for the child king Louis XIII. And with that, Marie de Medici ascended fully into the role she had long coveted. Her first act as Queen Regent was swift and symbolic. She expelled Henriette d'Entraigues from court. The mistress who had mocked her, undermined her, and toyed with her crown was finally banished, her name stricken from polite conversation. It was a moment of poetic justice, where the crown atop Marie's head finally held enough weight to protect her. But if Marie believed her reign would be smooth, she was quickly disabused of the notion. Rather than appease the wary French nobility, she surrounded herself with Italian confidants. Most controversially, her close companion Leonora Dori and Leonora's husband, Concino Concini. These foreign favorites were elevated with staggering speed, their positions gilded with unearned titles and privileges. Concini, a man with no military experience whatsoever, was inexplicably granted the prestigious title of Marshal of France. To the French aristocracy, it was nothing short of heresy. The backlash was immediate and ferocious. Nobles, threatened and outraged, began plotting. France simmered with discontent, and rebellious murmurs turned into open defiance. Yet Marie, sharp, cunning, and unrelenting, used each attempted uprising to solidify her authority. Like the born Medici she was, she turned every risk to her advantage. Until she overplayed her hand. For in her thirst for control, she made a fatal miscalculation. She refused to step aside. Even after Louis came of age in 1614, Marie clung to the reins of power with white-knuckled desperation. She dismissed his advisors, blocked his decisions, and ruled in all but name. It was not governance, it was dominance. And her son, now a young man seeking dignity and authority, could endure his mother's interference no more. In 1617, Louis XIII found his resolve. The coup was swift and merciless. Concino Concini was arrested and summarily executed by the royal guard. And for her steadfast decades of loyalty to Marie, Leonora Dori's reward was to be arrested and burned at the stake for sorcery. Their fall was the public price of Marie's ambition. As for the queen herself, she was exiled to the secluded Château de Blois, swiftly falling from monarch to gilded prisoner. But Marie de Medici was never going to fade quietly into history. In February of 1619, at the age of 43, Marie enacted her carefully crafted escape. With the help of loyal conspirators, she lowered herself down the castle walls under the cover of night, clutching a rope ladder as she climbed down the grueling 40-meter descent to safety. It was a feat of daring, defiance, and raw determination, a physical embodiment of the characteristics which had come to define her. From there, she did not flee to safety. She fled to war. Within months, she mounted not one, but 2 armed rebellions against her own son. It was a clash of both blood and crowns. Though Louis ultimately defeated her on the battlefield, Marie's refusal to yield became a legend in its own right. France had seen ambitious queens before, but few who returned from exile with such audacity. At last, in 1621, a weary and wary Louis XIII accepted the inevitable and invited his mother back to court. Not as a gesture of warmth, but as a truce. He could not govern in peace while her fury burned unchecked in the provinces. Her return was not precisely triumphant, but it was nonetheless a victory of a kind. For all the battles she had lost, Marie had won something far more elusive: relevance. Even dethroned, even disgraced, she had carved her name into the marrow of France. Perhaps intoxicated by her fleeting victory over her son, Marie proceeded to indulge in one of the most audacious artistic projects of her age. In 1622, she commissioned the Flemish master Peter Paul Rubens to immortalize her, not just as a queen, but as a living goddess. The result was a series of 24 colossal paintings, each designed to glorify Marie's life as a tale worthy of Olympus. She was not painted as a mere mortal, nor as a political figure, but as Juno, queen of the gods, divine mother, supreme sovereign. With mythological flourishes and radiant allegory, the cycle traced her life from miraculous birth to diplomatic reunion, where Marie, portrayed as an ever-gracious and loving mother, receives an olive branch from a wily, side-eyed Mercury, meant to represent her skeptical son, Louis XIII. It was a masterpiece of self-mythologizing, even at a time where the opulence of Baroque artistry was well known for elevating wealthy patrons to positions of godlike reverence. But even as Rubens captured her grandeur in oil and canvas, Marie's grasp on real power was slipping. Having driven a wedge between herself and her son, she sought a puppet to extend the reach of her influence indirectly. However, having successfully guided her son into the arms of her chosen marionette, the ambitious Cardinal Richelieu, Marie soon found herself undone by her own creation. At first, she had championed Richelieu's rise, shaping him, grooming him, and positioning him well on the proverbial chessboard that sat between herself and her son. But Richelieu, once obedient, became too powerful, and quickly rose to be the king's most trusted advisor, and Marie, as ever, could not abide rivals. She tried to oust him. She failed. By 1631, Louis XIII, no longer the stammering child pressed under his mother's thumb, had had enough. He banished his mother from France once and for all. This time, there would be no return, no rope ladder escape, no royal reprieve. Stripped of her title, her lands, and her dignity, Marie was sent into permanent exile, to live amongst the enemies of the crown she once wore. Her reign, such as it was over. And yet, Marie de Medici was still not content to disappear into the background. From Spain, she plotted, corresponded, and rallied. She remained a restless architect of dynasties. Of her 6 children, each secured powerful thrones across Europe. Her daughter Elizabeth became Queen of Spain. Henrietta Marie married England's King Charles I. A Medici to the end, Marie's bloodline threaded through the tapestry of European royalty. Even in her twilight, the hunger for influence did not abate. She spent her final years attempting to forge a bizarre League of Sons-in-Law, a last desperate alliance of her daughter's royal husbands to stand against France. It was a futile gesture, more symbolic than strategic, yet it revealed the truth of Marie de Medici. Power was not a pastime. It was her purpose. She could not let it go. Eventually, time caught up with her. Weakened by illness and dislocated from all she had once ruled, she found quiet refuge in Cologne, in a house gifted by none other than Rubens, the painter who had once turned her life into myth. In June 1642, Marie fell ill with pleurisy, and the fire that had burned so defiantly for decades began to flicker. Marie de Medici died on July 3rd, 1642. No court mourned her. No grand procession or state funeral marked her passing. The queen who had crowned herself a goddess died in obscurity and poverty, far from her native Florence and the French throne she had once dominated. With her passing, destiny offered one final grand flourish to her tale. On the 33rd anniversary of his father's assassination, and less than a year after Marie's death, Louis XIII followed his parents into the grave. Tuberculosis had ravaged his body over the winter and spring, and on May 14, 1643, he passed into history. Mother and son, locked in a lifelong duel of love, control, and ambition, were united again, if not in peace, at least in memory. Their struggle had shaped the destiny of France, their war outlasting armies and decades. In the end, it was not blood, nor marriage, nor the crown that defined them. It was each other. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factinate, for more incredible facts about everything.